back to Bitcoin Consciousness, and this is now episode number 3 in the Red Tail Hawk series. Red, how's it going?
Having a good Sunday. How are you?
Same. I'm excited to keep going. So maybe give us like a high level of what we're going to cover in this conversation, and briefly touch on maybe I'll briefly touch on what we talked about last time. So I remember specifically talking about there's basically evidence of like a flash freeze, and then we also had one of the major things that I can remember. We talked about what a pole flip might look like when you spun the little marble ball there that you had.
Yeah, it was a ocean jasper sphere, I think, was what I chose to use because it was actually unique enough in the external appearance to demonstrate the rotation.
You can see it turn, yeah.
Yeah, we covered reincarnation science and the importance of theta neural oscillations in Dolores Cannon's work and in like early childhood between ages 2 and 7. That happened to be the same period that like the University of Virginia's researchers like Dr. Ian Stevenson typically found that, that's who would naturally experience past life memories. We talked about some case studies from that research, and then we moved into the beginning conversation of the pole flip phenomenon and some sort of earthly mysteries, like you mentioned, the flash freeze, the Beresovka mammoth, the New Siberian Islands, etc. Lots of little data points that are, curiosities, like how did that happen,
Right, yep.
And yeah, there's multiple potential explanations for those things. However, the pole flip hypothesis seems to offer one cause that explains all of them, which is perhaps smoke that we should be, using as a signal to search for fire.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to consilience. There's a bunch of weird things that there isn't a consistent truth to explain, but there seems to be like an underlying possible cause here with this theory. And then, of course, we have evidence of human beings, and maybe this is what we'll get into in this conversation, but there are evidence of human beings talking about this cataclysmic event and writing it down in their histories or passing it down through word of mouth.
Very much. In fact, our alphabet is based on that very principle. The plan today was to sort of work our way through the remainder of the pole flip conversation. And then if we have time, it would be probably not the worst idea to parlay that into the conversation on ancient lost civilizations. Most of the time people focus on like Atlantis and or Tartaria. I am going to mention Atlantis, but we're not going to focus on it. We're going to look into the motherland of man known as Mu.
I've heard of Mu. One thing I was thinking about after our last conversation is this could be a potential explanation for what happened to the dinosaurs. Did we talk about that last time?
I don't know that we did, but if I don't disagree that this could have been what took them out. I'm not against the idea of like impact hypotheses,
right?
The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis that what's his name, Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock have talked about that significantly. I certainly allow that, more than pole flips can occur. And so a comet or a meteorite impact could do something to the planet that would wipe out, dinosaurs too, which I think that's the sort of mainstream consensus for what happened to the dinosaurs. But yeah, totally. I don't see any reason why it couldn't have been a pole flip. But then again, I haven't really focused too much on that or the yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm ready when you are. When you want to get into it.
All right. Well, where we left off, I basically finished listing out a lot of the sort of consistent stories from around the world that exist. The fact that languages seem so similar all around the world. And it just seems like before putting forth the case that pole flip cataclysms are the explanation for all of these curiosities, first, the Socratic method would suggest that a few definitions would be appropriate. So first, Earth's crust is, on average, about 60 miles thick and is known to science as the lithosphere, which simply means rock sphere. The lithosphere varies in thickness, ranging from as thin as 30 miles to as thick as 168 miles. Beneath the lithosphere is another roughly 60-mile thick layer. Unlike the relatively habitable lithosphere, the layer beneath it consists of semi-fluid molten rock and is called the asthenosphere. Material in the asthenosphere will yield to persistent stresses. That's ASTHENO sphere. So shortly before World War II, geophysicists discovered a method of determining the location of rocks on the Earth's surface at the time they were formed relative to the North Magnetic Pole, beginning the study known as Paleomagnetism, which produced some puzzling results. This new science showed that the magnetic North Pole had changed its location by thousands and even tens of thousands of miles, hundreds of times during the Earth's geological history. That speaks to what you just said, that it could have been, what caused the dinosaur extinction.
Yeah, it's just a cycle after cycle after cycle. Yeah.
And this meant one of two conclusions for scientists had to be true. Either the Earth's axis of rotation must have changed, which everyone found to be highly unlikely. I mean, conservation of momentum and everything, even if it's rotational momentum, it's still highly unlikely. And that's what caused them to think that the second possibility, the fact that the crust drifts over time, was more likely the case. And this is where the theory of continental drift arose. Scientists postulated that the lithosphere floated on the asthenosphere, and as the lithosphere drifted, the surface area that is located at the Earth's axis of rotation, that is at the geographic north and south poles, does not remain the same over long periods of time. They believed this accounted for the apparent wandering of the poles. Continental drift could explain some of the Earth's mysteries, like tropical life forms located within the Arctic Circle, the ringless, frozen, prehistoric trees of Spitsbergen, or Svalbard, as it's now known, and even evidence of glaciation at equatorial latitudes, but it doesn't explain a lot of other things. So revisiting the experimentation that was done by the Rand Corporation in the late 1940s, mentioned previously, recall that it was determined through repeated experimentation that as the magnetic pole approached the geographic pole, the magnetic pole would at some point accelerate its rate of convergence as though pulled towards the geographic pole by centripetal or center-seeking force, and jump to coincide. But instead of the poles coinciding, the magnetic pole would rapidly flip around the geographic pole and then spin off towards the equator as though by centrifugal or center-fleeing force, ending up at a position where the two axes assumed an approximate 89 degree divergence. Now, the word rapid offers us a concept very different from the word drift. Unless you're talking about Tokyo Fast and Furious, right? continental drift takes place on the order of low single-digit quantities of centimeters per year. And that's extremely slow. What if some massive force acted upon the Earth's crust and caused it to slip very fast? We know that the Earth is not dynamically balanced with respect to the distribution of mass on the surface. Rough computations from decades ago said that roughly 486 quintillion, that's 486 followed by 18 zeros, ton miles of torque tending to rotate the lithosphere is in play. And ton miles, by the way, for those familiar with torque measurements like foot-pounds, I think that the way it works out is that 1 ton mile is something like 10 million foot-pounds of torque. Wow. So these are big units and a lot of them.
That's crazy.
So if there's that much of a net torque bearing upon Earth's crust, why doesn't the Earth shift, right? Well, there are two main forces that keep the Earth's lithosphere in place. The first one we've sort of discussed already, right? The semi-plastic asthenosphere layer serves as a sort of glue, keeping the lithosphere from drifting rapidly. The other force is the magnetic coupling of magnetic portions of the lithosphere to the iron outer core via the geomagnetic field. There's a sort of sheet in our galaxy that we call a polarization sheet. It is responsible for the polarization of our galactic neighborhood, if you will. Occasionally, that sheet has a region that is somewhat bumpy or rippled. And whenever our region of space passes through such a bumpy region, it causes Earth to dip in and out of field reversals. Earth and the rest of Earth's solar system are passing through such a bumpy region right now. In the 1940s, the U.S. Air Force noticed that the magnetic North Pole had begun to move rapidly compared to over 100 years of relative location stability on Boothia Peninsula. I find it very hard to believe that this polar wander occurrence is merely coincidental with our solar system being impacted by passing through a bumpy portion of the galactic polarization sheet. It only makes sense that a ripple in the polarization sheet of our galaxy would impact our magnetic poles and our magnetosphere. Concurrent with the poles wandering, the strength of the magnetosphere is reduced. Over the last 150 years, scientists have noticed a weakening of the magnetosphere by 5 to 10%, which probably is the best explanation, more so than anthropogenic climate change than anything, is the weakening of the Earth's primary shield against solar weather. Mm-hmm. These are the big chess pieces on the board.
I was just thinking that. I was thinking about climate change, the idea of climate change as you were talking about the amount of torque and how uneven the lithosphere is. You know, I mean, it's not. I mean, this is not a 100% perfect spinning sphere that we're on. I mean, it's always changing. It's always going through cycles, and so for us as human beings to expect that from 1 year, even in like I would say 5 generations, that we should be seeing predictable weather patterns is somewhat of a ridiculous idea, because we have such a small window, in which to view the weather. So it makes complete sense to me that, we could very well see big changes in climate in different parts of the world.
Yeah. It certainly makes more sense to me to focus on the biggest chess pieces on the board, like the sun and our magnetic shielding from solar weather, right, than it does to, blame everyone's SUV or whatever. Like,
Right.
I'm not saying that, our consumption of fossil fuels has a non-zero impact on the matter, but, I think we're maybe focusing somewhat on the minor sources of causality as opposed to the major sources of causality.
Yeah, exactly. And the reason that I think that you even have to caveat it is because you sort of get looked at like a crazy person for even suggesting that there are other forces, that could be causing this to happen. It's become so ingrained into like our emotional psyche and our culture that we are the reason. And if you doubt it, then I don't know, you're a crazy person, basically. And that's not science, right? That's not actually what science is.
No, it's how the shadowy string pullers, the so-called elites, vampirically grift us for things like carbon taxes.
Right. Which has like slowly worked its way in. It's kind of weird because there wasn't like this big exciting thing about trading carbon credits and all this thing, but all of a sudden my dad, who is a farmer, he started talking about how I don't know if it was Amazon, but basically, there are these businesses, these large corporations, which are now buying this made-up currency, which is called carbon credits, from him as a farmer, because there are certain practices where he can, quote unquote, create this currency of carbon credits, and people will buy them from him. It's insane. It's really insane, especially when you talk about it in context relative to the things that we're discussing here, which are so much bigger, and like for us to like put so much importance and have so much of our, I guess, pride, have so much of our identity wrapped up in like, this is it, this is the only explanation. We human beings are all powerful and we know everything. It's completely backwards.
Yeah, sorry, I lost audio there for a second. The automatic cat feeder just went off, and the cat that was sitting on my lap decided to unplug my headphones, so I hope you can hear me again now.
I can hear you. Yeah, you're good. So anyway, I digress, so let's keep going.
All right. So additionally, we have what is known now as the South Atlantic Anomaly, which seems to be growing in size. And then you have the fact that the Earth's core has recently reversed spin, all sort of, as data points that are, as we like to say, conciliant with this perspective being offered, this hypothesis being offered.
So if I can interject again, did we go over the South Atlantic Anomaly?
No, we didn't. It's this area in the South Atlantic Ocean that is... Well, it's just the magnetic field, I guess, of the Earth there is showing sort of anomalous readings with respect to the rest of the planet. So
it's like a Bermuda Triangle type situation.
Perhaps, yeah. I will say that the Bermuda Triangle does have some... there may be a pyramid underwater that is causing that.
Interesting.
But, yeah. I think the pyramid is having energetic or vibrational effects that are probably worthy of being mentioned in the same conversation as, magnetic field shifts and whatnot too. So
wow, interesting.
Better scientists than me may be able to connect those dots more accurately or completely or cohesively or what have you.
Cool. And how do we know about the shifting of the spinning of the core of the Earth?
That's a good question. I've just seen reports on it, and I think that geologists use ground penetrating methods. I know that, for example, the Schumann resonance, the Earth's natural frequency, what they're like sort of shooting into the Earth is calibrated to roughly 7.5 hertz, which is pretty close to the Schumann frequency. So I think they're using that to sort of detect variations in material, almost maybe like the way that bats use their, sonar, I guess, to detect things, seeing without seeing kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
So yeah, while the impact hypotheses, like the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, certainly could explain and likely do explain some ancient cataclysms, evidence suggests that cataclysms on Earth have not been limited to impacts with space debris like meteors before. If the Rand Corporation's model wasn't just consistent but accurate too, the only thing that would facilitate such a model in reality is some kind of induced fluidity in the outermost strata of the asthenosphere, or maybe the whole asthenosphere itself. If a layer of the Earth temporarily shifts into lubricant mode, that lubricant layer would be best positioned as near as possible to the surface of the Earth. And the boundary zone between the lithosphere and the asthenosphere would seem to be the most reasonable place for a lubricant layer to form to facilitate a pole flip that would essentially cause every single tectonic plate to shift significantly within a rather brief span of time. So in order for the lands to become inundated, as narratives from every corner of the globe all describe, the acceleration of the land masses during the pole flip would need to be somewhat rapid in order for narratives like the legend of the long night, or the day the sun stood still, or the day that the sun set in the wrong direction to be true. The shift would need to take place in less than a day, like half a day or a quarter of a day. As it stands, the acceleration of the lithosphere by the torque estimated before, the 486 quintillion ton miles, would be almost nothing. The viscosity of the asthenosphere is estimated to be somewhere in the range of 10 to the 18th power to 10 to the 20th power of Pascal seconds, the units of measurement used to measure viscosity, right? In order to facilitate slippage of all tectonic plates, such that the polar ice caps are gyroscopically mediated to the equator, the viscosity of the asthenosphere would need to be reduced drastically down to the order of 10 to the first to maybe 10 to the third Pascal seconds. That's a big shift. Now, there's a non-zero chance that Swedish physicist and Nobel laureate Hannes Alfvén, Alfven, his work on magnetohydrodynamic energy could be relevant to the matter somehow. Alfvén's student, Stig Lundquist, did some testing involving passing current through mercury in a container while also subjecting the mercury to a strong pulsating magnetic field. The results of this were published in 1949, when an oscillating current was applied to the mercury in a strong axial magnetic field. It created forces that made the liquid wobble in waves that traveled through the mercury. So if mercury can essentially be made to dance with the right recipe of current and magnetic fields, perhaps another recipe of current and magnetic field conditions could have a similar effect on the asthenosphere.
Right. Like the what was it called? The magnetic sheet in our galaxy that has the inconsistencies in it. So if that had the right recipe, it could effectively make the shift, or I'll give the asthenosphere the viscosity required in order for this to shift.
Yep. And there may also be some subtle body contributions, some thought form contributions that, like Plato said, there's the world of, like, I guess, form or matter, and then there's, like, the world of ideals or thought forms. And, multiple traditions talk about how thought forms are actual entities that exist sort of beyond the veil, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
So if, humans are contributing, I guess, negative or what have you thought forms that could be getting lodged in the Asthenosphere, creating unusable heat and an increase in entropy, both of which correspond with an increase in, or I guess a decrease in the viscosity, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'll get into that in a subsequent episode after I've kind of laid more foundation for the source that comes from as potentially being a viable non-woo-woo source.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
cool.
So if polarity is like a part of everything material, right? Shifts in magnetic field conditions would seem to be at least one logical knob to tweak when seeking the recipe for induced asthenospheric fluidity. Electrical currents may be another factor affecting asthenospheric fluidity. The asthenosphere is highly conductive relative to the lithosphere. Telluric currents, Telluric, they balance charges between the ionosphere and the lithosphere and are primarily driven by solar and geomagnetic factors. Another interesting form of current is piezoelectric current, which is generated when pressure is applied to certain ceramics and crystals like quartz. Piezoelectric currents would be generated primarily by crystal and ceramic deposits in the upper lithosphere and would likely dissipate before reaching the asthenosphere. So maybe it's not that, but it at least warrants mention. Some modern scientific theories suggest that a solar flare or coronal mass ejection event could subtly trigger crustal faults via reverse piezoelectricity, potentially influencing shallow seismicity. In other words, earthquakes within roughly 37 miles or 60 kilometers of the surface. Reverse piezoelectricity occurs when an electric field is applied to a piezoelectric substance, causing the substance to change form. At this time, there is no smoking gun, so to speak, scientifically speaking, that could explain how the asthenosphere's viscosity could drop by 17 orders of magnitude to achieve the fluidity that would be necessary to allow for pole flips to occur. This doesn't mean that pole flips never happen. It may simply mean that we just don't know how they happen. It certainly would not be the first paranormal or extraordinary phenomenon known to occur without a full scientific explanation of how it occurs. In the hexagonal storm at Saturn's south pole, the dancing forest in Russia, the Honduran event in which fish rained down from the sky are all examples of this. Now, there is an esoteric source called the Law of One, also known as the raw material, that was channeled in the early 80s near Louisville, Kentucky. This is the source I was talking about earlier that hopefully I'll validate what it offers informationally more and more as we go through this content.
And are you still studying that in Flight Club?
Yes, yeah. We are. So basically a trio of seekers. You have Carla, the channel, Don, the questioner, and Jim, the scribe, channeled the entity known in ancient Egypt as Ra in 106 separate sessions in the early 80s. In those sessions, Ra responded to Don's questions using Carla's body as a sort of instrument, i.e., manipulating her vocal cords to produce intelligible speech. In session 17, that's 1-7, The first question asked by the questioner was, quote, "I got 3 questions just now in meditation. I'll ask them first before we continue. First, we are now in the 4th density. Will the effects of the 4th density increase in the next 30 years? Will we see more changes in our environment and our effect upon our environment?" End quote. Ra responded, quote, "The 4th density is a vibrational spectrum. Your time/space continuum has spiraled your planetary sphere and your, what we would call galaxy, what you call star, into this vibration. This will cause the planetary sphere itself to electromagnetically realign its vortices of reception of the instreaming of cosmic forces expressing themselves as vibrational webs, so that the Earth will thus be 4th density magnetized, as you might call it. This is going to occur with some inconvenience, as we have said before." Right? Just mildly, yeah. So, let's see. This is going to occur with some inconvenience, as we have said before, due to the energies of the thought forms of your peoples, which disturb the orderly constructs of energy patterns within your Earth spirals of energy, which increases entropy and unusable heat. This will cause your planetary sphere to have some ruptures in its outer garment, while making itself appropriately magnetized for 4th density. This is the planetary adjustment.
Wow.
So it seems, based on this material, that the energies of the thought forms of humans disturb the orderly constructs of energy patterns within the Earth's spirals of energy, which increases entropy and unusable heat. Low viscosity corresponds with higher entropy. Likewise, excess heat tends to lower the viscosity of fluids. That said, the remainder of this content will include the assumption that somehow, perhaps by the rationale presented by Ra, sufficient fluidity is induced in the asthenosphere that allows pole flips to occur within a fraction of a day, considering the consilience of multiple accounts attesting to astrological irregularities that are explainable in only so many ways. Misinterpretations of eclipses and pure fabrications probably top most people's lists of viable explanations for these types of stories, but pole flips would explain these oddities as well. I mean, during one of these events, the 486 quintillion ton-miles of torque exerted by Earth's unevenly distributed surface land masses causes the polar ice caps and the tectonic plates to which they are attached, as the RAND Corporation's models showed, to shift roughly 90 degrees, with the ice caps being gyroscopically mediated to the equator. Think about how Olympic figure skaters change the speed of their spins by centralizing or decentralizing their arm and leg mass. Mm-hmm. If the poles shift to the equator, this also means that 2 points that are currently on the equator will shift to the geographic poles. This also means that there will be 2 other equatorial pivot points that will remain at the equator before and after the event. Conceivably, the chaos of the event would be minimized near these equatorial pivot points. Consequently, survivability would likely be greater for species living at or close to those equatorial pivot points. Evidence of an uninterrupted string of evolution on the Malay Peninsula near like Malaysia and at the Galapagos Islands suggests that these were the equatorial pivot points of the last pole flip. According to Ben Davidson, Sun Weatherman on X, if anyone's there and follows him.
Mm-hmm. I think we talked about him in the last one.
Yeah, he suggests that there have been geomagnetic excursions roughly every 6,000 years, going back at least the last 48,000 years. 48,000 years ago, the event was called La Champ 1, L-A-S, and then champ like champion. 42,000 years ago is La Champ 2. 36,000 years ago, the event is called Mono Lake, M-O-N-O, Lake. The event from 30,000 years ago is unnamed. 24,000 years ago, the event is called Lake Mungo, M-U-N-G-O. 18,000 years ago, the event was called Helena Pali, H-I-L-I-N-A, space P-A-L-I. 12,000 years ago, the event was called Gothenburg. 6,000 years ago, it was called the China event. The precession of Earth's axis is 25,772 years long, roughly speaking. If we divide that into quarters, we get 6,443 years, which is very close to that 6,000-year periodicity of the geomagnetic excursions. Thinking about cycles, one might drift to thinking about sinusoidal waves, as sinusoidal waves are used to model cyclical action. So on a sinusoidal wave, there are four main points of interest within each wave cycle: the high, the low, and the 2 points where the wave crosses the midline of the wave. So looking from like a calculus vantage point, either the first derivative or the second derivative. The first derivative measures slope. For anyone who doesn't know that, I know you have engineering background, so maybe that's not anything new to you. And the second derivative and the second derivative, if it's negative, it means it's concave down, and if it's positive, it's concave up.
Right.
So the first or second derivative hits zero at each of those points, the high, the low, and the two midpoint crossings. So, it's easy to kind of wonder if the cycle of the precession of the axis is somehow tethered to the geomagnetic excursion period, as well as to the period between great flood events. If the asthenosphere ceases to serve in an adhesive capacity and temporarily shifts into lubricant mode, and the 486 quintillion ton-miles of torque act upon the Earth's crust, the tectonic plates will get dragged with the polar ice caps shifting roughly 90 degrees to the equator. What about the various bodies of water and the atmospheric air, though? Those fluids have momentum. They're used to rotating around the Earth at supersonic speeds at most habitable latitudes. Land is moving at the same speed, though. Land, water, and air are all moving together, so we don't experience the incredible force of supersonic winds or waters. Our perspective as surface dwellers is relative to the surface, which is moving. The wind would be especially bad if your location's shift arc moved your position, generally speaking, from east to west against the flow of those atmospheric winds. Mm-hmm. So imagine you took a baking sheet from your kitchen and you created a reasonably accurate topographical model of Earth's surface out of sand or dirt or whatever. You shaped continents and mountain ranges, carved out seas and major lakes, and then filled in the rest of the baking pan with water to model the oceans. Now, imagine that baking sheet was placed on an airport travelator, those horizontal moving walkways one might find most often in airport terminals. Now, imagine that this particular travelator has a random 45-degree offset at a certain point. As the baking pan scale topographical model of Earth, land, and water bodies traverses that 45-degree turn, one should expect some cataclysmic sloshing of the water in that pan. The model's ocean water would be expected to slosh violently across the modeled lands. Scale-sized observers on that model would experience incredibly tall waves that completely inundate the lands, flooding everything, wiping out most life, most structures, most signs of civilization, etc. Now, envision the Earth, right? Its circumference at the equator, the perimeter around it, is 24,901 miles, or about 40,000 kilometers. Person standing on the Earth, on the equator, travels that far every 24 hours, meaning that the equatorial ring around the Earth is moving at roughly 1,037 miles per hour, which is supersonic. Atmospheric air, lakes, oceans, and land located at the equator all move at that speed. For reference, even at a 45-degree latitude north or south, the Earth is still moving faster than 730 miles per hour. Supersonic speed is 768 miles per hour. So for those in North America, for reference, the Canada-US border is at the 48th parallel, so almost the entirety of the contiguous 48 US states would be in the supersonic speed range.
Right, supersonic. Gotcha. Okay. Very fast.
Yeah. I ran some very basic physics calculations based off of, and I don't know how to pronounce this, Cuenca, Ecuador, Cuenca, which has an approximately 4,500 meter elevation change from sea level within a very short range of the west coast. 1,037 mile per hour water hitting that elevation change would probably be thrown very high in the air. If we model that elevation change as a simple 45-degree ramp in order to estimate the vertical component of that water coming off of that ramp, it would be roughly 733 miles per hour upwards. Wow. Converting that to meters per second, that's roughly 328 meters per second of upward initial velocity. And let's see, based on this calculation, the water's change in height would be roughly 5,400, 5,500 meters, which is about 3.4 miles of vertical displacement. If we only assume a 30-degree ramp angle and adjust our calculations accordingly, we still get a change in elevation of about 2,700, 2,800 meters, or roughly 1.7 miles. Now, again, this is a very pixelated model. The main point is that if the momentum of the Earth's oceans is somehow, forced to ramp against land masses and mountain ranges because the Earth starts shifting in a secondary vector at the same time as it's still sort of rotating in its normal rotation vector, it's going to cause some massive waves. Mm-hmm. So, imagine being on Earth, observing this event happen, and living through it, right? Maybe you're in a mountaintop cave, and maybe you saw a mile-high wave moving at supersonic speeds, wiping out everything. you would have witnessed something so extraordinary that to anyone who did not witness it, seems literally incredible and unimaginable. Survivors of such a traumatic experience would speak of the Great Flood event. These stories would become cultural transmissions from generation to generation, like the story of Noah's Ark, the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, or the story of Hanok and the deluge from the Kolbrin. 99% of life on the planet would likely be wiped out. Survivors of each species would become the new prototype of the species, which leads to the observed leaps of evolution from one epoch to the next. And this offers a reasonable explanation for punctuated equilibrium. When accounting for the likely malnutrition survivors and early generations would endure, the idea of goat-sized beavers evolving to be smaller makes sense. Lack of sustenance leads to malnourished parents, and malnourished parents typically means malnourished offspring. Malnourishment during critical periods of development can lead to stunted growth. In addition to explaining punctuated equilibrium, which again is just the idea that there are these observed leaps in evolution within a species. It's not like a clean, smooth, pattern from one to the next. There are these sort of quantum jumps, almost like what X-Men talks about in the first X-Men movie, in the prelogue.
Yep.
A pole flip every 6,000 to 7,000 years would be well able to account for a number of the earthly mysteries mentioned already. Other things could explain a number of those mysteries too, but it's worth exploring how periodic pole flips could explain them all. Glaciation at equatorial latitudes and evidence of tropical life in polar regions could be explained by continental drift, but pole flips explain them too. The granite blocks that we talked about last time, found in the Jura Mountains, that we know originated in the Alps, 50 to 80 miles away, could be explained by a fast-moving tidal wave caused by an asteroid impact, or they could have been swept across the Swiss Valley that distance by supersonic waters inundating the lands during a pole flip. If waters sweep across the lands, they would pick up tons of topsoil, animals, all sorts of debris in a supersonic rampage. Anyone who has ever seen the aftermath of a flood may have noticed patterned concentration of flood debris. This explains the composition of all the new Siberian islands that are made up almost entirely of mammoth, buffalo, deer, horse, saber-toothed cat, giant beaver, and other animal remains. Those islands were most likely formed due to a concentration of flood debris. The only question is whether they were formed due to a meteoric impact wave, a tsunami, a pole flip related wave, or something else. The Beresovka mammoth we talked about last episode probably got swept up in the same event that created the new Siberian islands. The mammoth was likely living in a temperate or tropical zone that was shifted to a polar zone during the cataclysmic shift, hence the rapid freezing. The American Frozen Food Institute's research, at the behest of biologist Ivan T. Sanderson, on the Beresovka mammoth, is strong evidence in favor of a pole flip as the cause of both the Beresovka mammoth and the formation of the new Siberian islands. The broken foreleg and pelvic bone demonstrate extreme levels of force and violence, like 1,000-mile-per-hour, mile-high tidal waves. Now, it might not have been the water that broke the Beresovka mammoth's leg and pelvis. It may have been what monstrously huge forms of debris the water was carrying along with it, like the granite boulders that are multi-ton blocks that got swept across the Swiss Valley. If the Beresovka mammoth got hit with something like one of those granite blocks, who knows how badly its body could have been damaged. Those multi-ton granite blocks could have been relocated from their point of origin in the Swiss Alps 50 to 80 miles across the Swiss Valley at the same elevation in the Juras if 1,000-mile-per-hour floodwaters torrented across the land. Bear in mind that 1 foot of water moving at 20 miles per hour, roughly 32 kilometers per hour, can move a car.
Wow.
Less water than that can sweep a car away.
Mm-hmm.
So this is potentially 30 to 50 times worse than that in terms of water speed alone. It seems moot to attempt to estimate just how much worse a mile-high wave would be than a foot of moving water.
Right.
So, of course, there are the legends of the long night, the day the sun stood still, and the day the sun set backwards that Chan Thomas mentioned in his book, The Adam and Eve Story. Imagine living through one of these cataclysms thousands, possibly tens of thousands of years ago. Imagine that the place where you're able to take shelter affords you a view of the sun on that day. For your entire life, you'd watched the sun progress from east to west in the sky. But on this day, because of the crust shift, imagine that your location on the Earth shifts generally east to west as well. Depending on the speed of the crust shift, and depending on how long it has been since sunrise, it could appear as if the sun began moving in the opposite direction and set in the east. At some point after that, the crust shift would stop and eventually the sun would rise again in the east and resume normalcy. And that could explain the day the sun set backwards. Likewise, if the sun had not risen yet and survivors experienced an east to west shift, that would extend their night and explain the legend of the long night. Alternatively, if your location on the crust was such that the net trajectory of your arc of travel during the pole flip was west to east, and if the speed of the crust shift was able to keep pace with Earth's rotational speed, it could appear as if the sun stood still. Of course, since the poles are shifting 90 degrees to the equator, generally speaking, there would be no east to west shifts, but there are certain locations, depending on where the equatorial pivot points are located, who would experience a net east to west shift. It would be on a 90-degree arc, so it wouldn't be a purely east to west move, but the north-south motion would be limited the closer the location was to one of the equatorial pivot points. Likewise, the account from the Kolbrin, in which the sun was not as it was, and a moon was taken away, could make sense under certain circumstances. Imagine if someone living in like North Dakota lived through a pole flip where North Dakota was 90 degrees away from both equatorial pivot points, meaning North Dakota would be shifting over 6,000 miles to roughly the same latitude, but on the other side of the northern hemisphere, right? Now imagine if it was nearly sunset when that happened, and you flipped over onto the sunrise side of the northern hemisphere. By flipping from the western hemisphere to the eastern hemisphere, one could bypass an evening cycle or a moon. Now, it's not just supersonic, mile-high walls of water ripping across the lands that causes the devastation. There's also the atmosphere. Like the ocean waters, the atmosphere has rotational momentum, so the air is going to be blowing just as fast as the water is inundating the lands. We're also talking about tectonic plates moving, and not just the edge between two plates, but every plate on the planet. there would be earthquakes everywhere during the shift. Chasms can open up 60 miles deep, allowing the asthenosphere below to get squeezed up and out of the chasm, melting bedrock and altering topography, like the formation at Mexican Hat out in Utah. The seismic activity would undoubtedly cause volcanoes to pop off, spewing lava, ash, and gases into the environment. The tectonic plates smashing up against each other would form new trenches and mountain ranges. Entire continents could rise out of the ocean or fall below sea level, depending on how the cookie crumbles. As if the initial supersonic inundation of ocean water onto lands wasn't enough, the tectonic plates slipping against each other under seas would cause tsunamis, causing more massive waves. The fact that the ice caps have shifted to the equator means that there are now massive chunks of ice located at the equator. The direct heat of the sun will immediately go to work melting all that ice. The surrounding, relatively warm ocean water will also begin melting the ice cap. That ice melting will have effects on ocean waters, both in terms of temperature and salinity levels, which will cause further chaos in ocean currents and Earth's weather in general. All sorts of storms would be expected. It would pretty much be a free-for-all when it comes to extreme weather. Some might call it Ragnarok or an apocalypse. There would be an intense fog for the first day or two that envelopes the new equatorial region due to the ice caps melting. It would be so bad that nobody would be able to see the moon or the stars. By the second evening, the moon might be bright enough to be visible through the fog, but maybe not the stars. After another day, maybe the stars might be visible again. As the floodwaters recede, a huge homogeneous layer of flood silt would have been deposited across vast areas of land, burying any buildings that withstood the cataclysmic violence. Occasionally, one might see buildings being unearthed nowadays. Sometimes these buildings are extremely well crafted out of stone. People often suggest that these buildings were chiseled out of the surrounding stone. To me, it makes more sense that these ancient buildings were built using typical methods, but they got buried under successive layers of flood silt that, over the course of many years, ossified into stone that tightly hugged each curve and corner of the once above ground buildings.
Yeah, because we were talking about how dinosaur fossils aren't necessarily the bone itself as much as it's just like the way that it's basically like a big injection mold. And I never thought about that as a possibility for buildings too. It's like a fossilized building.
Right. And the flood silt would deposit in a fluid manner, so, fluid conforms to the shape of its container, or in this case, the shape of the obstacle around which it's settling. So that would explain why it hugs every crevice of these buildings so tightly. Mixed in with that layer of freshly deposited flood silt would be the bodies of many animals of the same species vintage, so to speak, that got swept up in the flood. This would, again, offer a plausible explanation for why punctuated equilibrium in evolution corresponds so well with stratigraphy. Also mixed up in that layer of flood silt would be the seeds of the plants that got swept up in the inundation. So after a few days, there would be sprouts starting to pop up out of the new silt layer. Surviving humans and other animals would be hungry after hunkering down for a few days, so they might have noticed some seedlings sprouting, as they may have been the only thing available to forage. There's a lot of correspondence between how the sequence of post-flood events would unfold to content from the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Many might have expected to pivot to the study of Noah's Ark here, And while the cataclysm scenario just described may very well be what caused Noah's flood, instead, the 7-day creation story is what is in scope for us right now. Science tells us that the Earth is over 4 billion years old, so the 7-day creation story is a little weird, right? I mean, even dogmatic Christians and Jews and Muslims will acknowledge that the 7-day creation story, something's off there. Oftentimes it gets explained as, oh, well, maybe
it's like an allegory or something.
Right. I prefer to give our ancestors a little more credit than that in their reporting. I think that's a little more loving. So if the Genesis creation story is broken down into bullet points, one might get the following output from that exercise. First, you've got, in the beginning, the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Within the first day, there was light, but initially there was darkness. Within the second day, it focuses on the establishment of firmament, aka land, versus water. It talks about waters that were above the land and below. Waters above the land sounds like flood waters to me. Water below the land sounds like oceans that exist at ocean level, that defines shorelines, where land is definitionally above the water. Day 3 is a continuation of day 2 insofar as the establishment of shorelines is concerned. On that same day, seedlings sprouted. On day 4, there were lights in the heavens to divide day from night. There was the greater light, the sun, that ruled the day, and the lesser light, the moon, that ruled the night. The stars and signs, like the constellations of the zodiac, are mentioned, as well as tools useful for tracking astrological signs and seasons. Day 5, the creatures of the earth became present, including birds, fish, and land creatures alike. Day 6 seems to be suggesting the living representatives of each type of species, from man to cattle to every creeping thing and beast of the earth, would have descendants after his kind. Moving to Genesis 2 for day 7, it says that the heavens and earth were finished, and on the 7th day, God rested. Genesis 2 also says, quote, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens and every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground." So looking at the information that was shared in this story in juxtaposition with the scenario of surviving a pole flip, one might begin to wonder how well these two things align, right? Imagine being a survivor of one of these pole flips. Imagine seeing the sun set backwards, or imagine having a 16-hour long night, or imagine witnessing the sun stand still in the sky as far as you could tell amidst the chaos of the event. If the sun set backwards, or you were experiencing the legendary long night, you might anxiously wonder if the sun was broken somehow, and if life on Earth was about to go extinct, right? Once the Earth settled into its new shell orientation and a new day dawned upon your location at your new latitude, it might seem like a cause for celebration. Mm-hmm. So much so that one might even name a day of the week in honor of the sun coming back into a regular rotation.
Yeah, right.
And that regular rotation was like as it once had before the cataclysm. As Genesis 2 pointed out, quote, there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Again, if we understand that the polar ice caps just gyroscopically mediated to the tropical zone, we can imagine that a lot of polar ice cap ice is going to get hit with a lot of direct solar heat, especially if the magnetosphere is recovering from a crash in strength. In that case, a very large volume of very cold, very desalinated fresh water will be melting into the world's oceans and form new freshwater lakes. Mist forms similar to how fog forms. Air cools to the dew point. Relative humidity is near 100%. Air becomes moisture saturated with temperatures cooling to the dew point. For reference, the typical dew point one might expect to see in the HVAC, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning industry, is 55 degrees Fahrenheit or 13 degrees Celsius. So for reference, on the size of the Antarctic ice cap, which is growing at a rate of approximately 1 Lake Ontario per year, that's a lot of pent-up, freezing cold fresh water that will be melting very rapidly. So when all of a sudden there are massive chunks of 32-degree ice and ice melt water immediately around it getting hit with direct sunlight for 12 hours a day, you're going to get conditions that are conducive to mist formation.
Steaming, right.
We're talking about big chess pieces here, though, with the sun and the polar ice caps, so this would be a big mist. It would be such a big mist that it would potentially band the tropical zone in cloudy, foggy haziness until the ice caps had melted and the new equator had assumed a typically equatorial climate. Again, if this is happening simultaneously with a crash in magnetospheric strength, that would expedite the melting of the ice caps. So imagine that when one of these crust shift, pole flip cataclysms occurs, there would be 2 pivot points at the current equator that also become parts of the new equator. Imagine that the survival rate might be higher at these pivot points, which would mean that survivors passing down these stories would have likely been in the equatorial region that got misted by the melting ice caps spoken of in Genesis 2. And this might explain why we have witness accounts describing this great mist. If there's a massive, foggy, hazy mist, any astronomer knows you're going to have a hard time seeing anything like the moon or the stars. Survivors of any such cataclysms of the past would likely have been more than aware of the moon and stars. They would have been just as aware, in fact, more aware than modern city-dwelling humans are. The light pollution in the cities prevents huge portions of the human population from developing a relationship of familiarity with the stars. So perhaps the sun's brightness was enough to penetrate the mist on the first day after the cataclysm, but again, perhaps the moon and the stars were not bright enough to penetrate that misty veil until another day had passed and some of the mist had cleared up. Perhaps this is why the next day after Sunday is Moon Day, right?
Yeah, that's interesting.
So after a day or two of tidal waves, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic activity, hurricanes, tornadoes, and all sorts of dangerous weather patterns, the tectonic plates would have settled into their new places. The earthquakes would have mostly stopped, meaning tsunami and volcanic activity would have also mostly stopped. The initial inundation floodwaters would have had a day or two to recede, allowing some shorelines to form and allowing some seedlings to sprout atop the layer of flood silt left behind by the receding waters. Once the weather calms down and seedlings start to sprout, again, any surviving animals would probably be pretty hungry and thirsty after several days of hunkering down and taking shelter. Human survivors might begin to observe animals coming out from their shelters to go scavenge or hunt. And all of these things were the way it was before, with oceans and land being separated by shorelines, with the sun, moon, and stars, with plants and animals, etc. To someone experiencing this cataclysm, they might have thought they were experiencing the end of the world and all they knew. And while the world they knew did change, it did not change completely. In the eyes of the survivors, things would, in some ways, return to normalcy insofar as they still needed to work to eat, work to get water, work to produce clothing, shelter, etc. The same resources that were available before the cataclysm would still be available after the cataclysm. Some survivors might have characterized this quasi return to normalcy by saying things once again were, quote, as God intended, since that's the way it was before. We ate seeds, fruits, vegetables, had dominion over the other animals, etc. before, and we do again now. The work of James Churchward, church just like church and word W-A-R-D, seems to offer some validation to the idea that Genesis 1 was a great flood détente narrative, more so than it being a creation story. Mm-hmm. The notion that Earth was created in 6 days flies in the face of scientific estimates that the Earth is billions of years old, as we said earlier. Mm-hmm. Churchward himself did not push this idea. However, his work on the Naga language enabled Chan Thomas to offer a retranslation of Genesis. Chan Thomas, it seems, studied Augustus Le Plongeon, that's L-E space P-L-O-N-G-E-O-N, and James Churchward.
You've been practicing that pronunciation?
Je suis francophone, although
okay.
I took French in high school and a semester in college. So
nice.
I
can tell.
I was going to say, I'll acknowledge your compliment there. My French teachers always told me I had excellent pronunciation.
Nice.
So one of Churchward's big contributions was the linking of ancient Naga glyphs from northeastern India with the glyphs of ancient Mayans in the Western Hemisphere. According to Churchward, the Naga glyphs are identical to the Mayan glyphs. They are basically the same language. That's a very important fact that bears upon the topic of ancient lost civilizations and certain etymological oddities. If we look at the concepts that are present in the biblical Adam and Eve story itself, things like tree, fruit, serpent, cherubim, word of fire, and other words used by the author of Genesis, it is evident that the 7-day creation story and the Adam and Eve story may both have been originally written in the Naga/Mayan glyph language. The glyphs that exist within this Naga-Mayan language seem to match up very well to the major elements within these stories. So if Genesis 1 was originally written in the Naga-Mayan language, it would be simple enough to attempt to reverse engineer the original script based upon the English translation of a translation that we have today. Chan Thomas did reverse engineer that original form, or a speculative estimate of that original form. So here's a translation of that creation story according to Chan Thomas, based upon the linguistic work of James Churchward. In the beginning, the universe was created in God's great design. Included was our sun and our planet Earth. And during one of the many cataclysms that occurred during the Earth's history, the Earth's lands were all inundated with raging waters and ravaged by horrendous winds, and the oceans were all dark with muddiness. And the ill wind thundered over the troubled waters also. And as the storms abated, sunlight came back to the face of the earth as God intended. And while the cataclysm was abating, once more darkness and sunlight were reestablished and distinguishable, and it was good. And sunlight was again daytime, and darkness again nighttime, in accordance with God's design, and evening and morning made one day. Again, God's original design was that there would be a sky between the clouds and oceans, and in accordance with God's design, the heavens were reestablished, in that the sky again stood between the clouds and the oceans, as the onslaught of the great cataclysm abated. And God's heavens were indeed reestablished, and that evening and morning were the beginning of the second day. And God's design was that the lands would not be entirely covered by the oceans, as they were immediately following a cataclysm. So the disrupted oceans, now settling, drained off the higher lands. And in accordance with God's design, the dry land was earth, and the waters oceans, and once again it was reestablished and good, as God intended. And since God's design was that the earth should bring forth grass and herbs yielding their seed, and the fruit yielding fruit containing its seed, and the earth was again reestablished. Therefore the earth, being reestablished, brought forth grass and herbs, yielding their seed, and the fruit tree, yielding fruit containing its seed. And it was good, as God intended. And the evening and the morning were the start of the third day. In accordance with God's design, there were normally lights in the heavens, which served to indicate months and seasons and days and years. Also, they served to furnish light on the earth, as God intended. And as the great fog lifted and the clouds broke, the sun and the moon reappeared, and also the stars. And once again, as God intended, they shone from the heavens. And the sun and the moon again were able to divide light and darkness, which was good. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fourth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature living and bird flying should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving, then, were the great whales, and every living creature of the sea, and every kind of winged fowl, and it was as God intended, and good. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and reproduce, and replenish the oceans with sea life, and the air with fowl. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fifth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving, then, were the beasts, the cattle, and everything that creeps on the earth. And it was as God intended and good. And in accordance with God's design, man, who was created in the image God intended, also was to survive and have dominion over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So it was God's design that man, who was created in the image God intended, both male and female, would survive the cataclysmic inundation. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and control it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And God's design was that man, being given every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to man it should be for food, and to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, wherein there is life, God's design was that green herbs shall serve for food, and it was as God intended. And everything which survived was as God had originally created, and still was in God's design, and was good. And the evening and the morning were the beginning of the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were reestablished, all the host of them, and on the seventh day the recovery from the cataclysm and flood were complete, And the seventh day brought rest from the fight for survival against the cataclysm and its after effects. And the seventh day brought God's blessed peace, as the cataclysm had abated, leaving those of his creation who survived.
Wow.
Lines up pretty well, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the story is translated from a text found somewhere in India, you said?
Yeah, we're going to get into James Churchward's work and some of his backstory, and William Nivens, who, his work finding certain tablets in the Mexico City region allowed Thomas to, have this link and sort of retranslate Genesis via this language.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So I guess the question remaining is, how many confirmation biased liberties did Chan Thomas take when putting together this translation? Based on his book, he believed that the pole flip hypothesis to be valid, so it would be understandable for there to be some confirmation bias baked into the translation. It is pretty undeniable, however, that when the 7-day story from Genesis 1 and 2 is viewed through the lens of a survivor's account of the 7-day period following one of these periodic pole flip crust-shifting cataclysms, the story starts to look more like a regenesis narrative rather than a Genesis narrative. For one thing, 6 days doesn't equal out to billions and billions of years. Furthermore, how would the actual Genesis story have been received or recorded in the first place anyways? There were no witnesses or life forms in the beginning. The most likely reason that the 7-day Genesis story was called a creation narrative is because someone decided it was a creation narrative. That decision got traction, and translation after translation brought it closer and closer to a creation narrative. Just because a square peg got worked over until it fit into a round hole doesn't necessarily make the peg a circular peg, and it certainly doesn't mean that it started out as a circular peg. So the pole flip hypothesis, without a smoking gun as the trigger for induced fluidity in the Asthenosphere, could explain a lot of earthly curiosities. There's one more major topic that it may explain as well. This pole flip hypothesis seems to offer a viable explanation for how an entire civilization and the continent upon which it dwelt could be lost. Most people focus on Atlantis in the conversation of lost civilizations. But if the Naga and the Mayan languages are as identical as Churchward suggests, that alone warrants more attention be paid to investigating Mu.
Mm-hmm.
So basically at this point, we're ready to look into ancient lost civilizations. So I might have maybe another 8 pages or so of content on that, so maybe another hour roughly.
Okay, excellent. So that'd be good for the next one, you think?
We can save that for next one. I'm good to keep going now, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, let's save it. We'll keep breaking it up the way that we have. We'll save that for the next one. See if I have any further, I guess, remarks on what we covered in this conversation. So one of the visuals that came to my mind as you were explaining this is like, it's like a dog when it gets wet. It's like shaking everything. It's just shaking everything off.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of like what Mother Earth is doing a little bit. She's just like, shit, I don't know. She's like got all this tension and she's just shaking everything and completely resetting brand new.
Nature is entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, creation wasn't a single event. It's an ongoing process.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to me that the Earth would go through these periodic resets and it would allow, the majority of each species to get wiped out, leaving only a few survivors that would become the prototypes of the next species. That's a natural method of establishing some sort of novelty in these leaps in evolution that we perceive as punctuated equilibrium.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, you've done an excellent job at telling the story for sure. I think it's very interesting and incredibly vivid, and I don't see any reason to suggest that this certainly was not a possibility. So, like, the Genesis stories of other religions, are they all similar to like the Christian Bible, the Genesis story?
There's enough alignment in them to, extract the potential for consilience, especially allowing for the idea that, if you've ever played Telephone, that game in like grade school, right?
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Stuff gets distorted, and just within passing a message from one student to the next, from the beginning of the class lining up to the end of the class lining up. So it seems more than reasonable to me that through thousands of years and hundreds of generations and multiple translations, and the loss of primary documents, and maybe people filling in gaps and then reestablishing those documents with I guess speculations injected into them. I mean, things can get a little distorted over the course of time. I think that's what winds up happening with the belief sets of every religious tradition. That's one of the reasons that I think Fulcanelli, I forget the exact quote, but he basically said that the philosophers should be read with a grain of salt. In some cases, the whole salt shaker.
Yeah.
I think we have to read the tea leaves. Some might argue that's cherry picking, and
right.
I can't really defend myself against that.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I guess there are ways to explain all of these earthly mysteries that don't involve these pole flip cataclysm events.
Sure.
But then again, all of these things could be explained by one thing, and from like an Occam's razor vantage point, that's reducing your number of unknowns down to basically one unknown, which is where does the induced fluidity come from in the asthenosphere that allows the crust to shift rapidly within the span of a fraction of a day like that.
Yeah.
That seems like a step forward to me, or at least a worthy perspective for consideration as being viable, I guess.
Yeah. So do you, I know we'll get more into the ancient civilizations, but like, are you getting a sense through your research, are you getting a sense for the technological advancement of those people at the time? Were they more or less spiritual than we are today?
So the people of Mu were, according to the Law of One and Ra's reporting, very advanced spiritually. The people of Atlantis were, again, according to Ra and I think other accounts, very advanced technologically. The people of Atlantis apparently became too top-heavy with their technology. Dolores Cannon's work suggests that crystal technology, which can be very powerful, was behind the Younger Dryas event that wiped out Atlantis. Their sort of interest in creating new life forms and basically playing God.
Yeah.
Was sort of negatively polarized, service to self-oriented,
yeah.
As opposed to using their spiritual advancements to sort of work on themselves as, souls to grow and develop. So apparently that is, what contributed to at least one of the two cataclysms that wiped out Atlantis, according to the Law of One.
Mm-hmm.
So,
were they? So, like in the Law of One, were these two civilizations co-inhabiting the planet at the same time?
No, and that's someplace where the Law of One differs from sort of other reports on these civilizations. Like that, you can go on YouTube and search and find like content about Mu being at war with Atlantis. According to the Law of One, Mu existed roughly 53,000 years ago, which aligns with page 1 of James Churchward's first book, where he says, according to his sort of more, grounded Indiana Jones, boots on the ground, travel everywhere, inspect everything, personally research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mu existed roughly 50,000 years ago. That's 50 versus 53,000. That's a pretty minor error gap there.
Right.
And based on all of our accounts from what Plato and whatnot, Edgar Cayce maybe, I think, talked about Atlantis somewhat. That was all around like 12,000 years ago.
Right.
And like the Gothenburg event, I think it was called, according to Ben Davidson, kind of aligns with the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis time period that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock and whatnot talk about.
So it's like, from 50,000 years ago, it seems like the spiritual evolution trend is going into more and more darkness, more and more separation. Because Mu, it sounds like 50,000 years ago, which would have been about 4 cycles ago. 4 of these 12,000 year. If this is a repetitious cycle, so that would be 4 shifts or 4 flops back and forth. Mu would be spiritual, very spiritually elevated, and then Atlantis less so. I guess, there's a couple cycles between there, and then of course now, where we're extremely technologically advanced, but probably the most in such a way that we can be with being so spiritually unaware. Does that make sense? Right? Because there are elements of our reality that I think play a huge part in technological advancement, from quantum physics and like the manipulation of crystalline energies and all this kind of stuff. But modern day science basically ignores all of that, and all of our technology kind of ignores that the human element or the more esoteric element. So I think we're very technologically advanced, but in an extremely materialistic and scientifically grounded kind of way. So it does seem like we've kind of devolved and become more separate from the spiritual element of our humanness over time. And it would be interesting, like, is it going to continue? Would it continue this way with the next cycle, or would it eventually go back up?
I'm thinking that if the pole flip cataclysm cycle is valid, that, it would be pretty easy for survivors to identify what they survived as an act of God of some sort.
Yeah.
It's just, like I said, total Ragnarok. Everything's popping off at the same time. And they would have never seen anything like that in their entire lives before. So, I think, and especially for the survivors, there would be an intense amount of gratitude for being able to survive that. I can imagine that it almost serves as like a reset mechanism, spiritually speaking.
For sure.
It certainly serves as a reset, technologically speaking. A lot of our facilities, our libraries, books, knowledge accumulation would be swept away. So it would almost serve as a reset for technology and also for evidence of these, lost civilizations. One thing I want to remark on is, like megaliths, the large stone structures that we know exist. Like, again, Graham Hancock's show kind of focuses on these things.
Yeah.
And we don't know how these things were created, although there's a guy, a Hungarian gentleman named Marcel Foti. He's on X at FoMaHun, and he wrote a book called The Natron Theory, which basically explains how you can use the substance called natron to pretty much melt granite into something that's essentially like Play-Doh. It's like rock dough.
Right.
And you can create molds with, wood and cloth. And you can basically, by aggregation, gather a bunch of gravel much more easily than you could move a giant multi-ton
Exactly. And just
block.
melt it into place.
Yeah, you make your cast form, and then maybe you put it on a truss or something. And if you look at some of these megalithic structures, there are nubs or sometimes scoop marks or perfect holes drilled in them. And this is all well before, the Iron Age or any age where we would have had metals that were hard enough to drill perfect holes or to scoop. Like, how does that happen? It seems to me that it's much more reasonable to suggest that, well, it just wasn't hard rock at the time. It was soft rock, and it hardened with time as the water drained out of it. Yeah. And that's where those nubs, he thinks, came from. Is it so the water has to drain out of this rock slurry in order for the rock dough to harden into rock. And he calls them geopolymers, but so that there has to be a drainage port. So what they would do, he thinks, is build their template, their form, fill it with the rock slurry, the rock dough, but they would leave an opening, a circular opening at the bottom, and they would cover it with some cloth to prevent the rock dough from just totally plopping out. But it would allow the water to drain out. But the weight of the rock dough would bear upon that cloth somewhat and create a bulge, and that's what those nubs are.
Wow.
That hardens, and then they take the rock, and I guess probably using some kind of a leverage or whatever, beasts of burden, they're able to tilt it into place, and that's the only heavy lifting that has to be done. And with that, you're only tilting it. So the structure that the cast form is supported by is really bearing most of the weight. You're only kind of manipulating the stone by rolling it, which doesn't require nearly as much force to accomplish.
Right. Yeah, that's super cool to think about. It reminds me a little bit of these channeled books called the Seth Speaks. You familiar with those?
I've heard of them, and whenever I've talked about the Law of One at times in the past, it sometimes comes up. I have yet to dive into them.
I read, that was one of the first more esoteric books that I read as I was starting my spiritual journey. And I remember in that book, Seth talking about there being there's been many, many, many different human civilizations, thriving human civilizations on this planet. And in one particular example that he gave, he talked a lot about how human beings had basically figured out how to manipulate everything with vibration. Their vehicles ran on some kind of resonance, so they didn't need combustion engines or anything. They just tuned their vehicles to some kind of vibrational energy that allowed them to move. And the same with the way that they built things. So everything was, I think even more specifically, it was sound. Like he basically said that all of their technology was focused around having like perfect sound resonance with certain things. I don't know if they had some kind of tool or some mechanism which could create a very, very specific and unique sound wave to any object or material, and they could manipulate it any way that they chose. And that reminds me a little bit about what you're kind of describing too. So yeah, I think we're so limited. And even, I've listened to someone recently who basically said that maybe not Newtonian, the model of the atom and all of the subatomic particles isn't necessarily as settled as we believe it to be. That, because we can only actually see so far down, we might be making some pretty grand assumptions as to the model of, the reality that we cannot see on a minute scale. And there's no reason to believe that it's not just light, what is light? Light is just vibration, and so what are these models for reality can be very limiting to a certain extent, and they can kind of lock us into believing, well, this is the only way that you can manipulate this material because it behaves in this way, because it's an ion, it's magnetized in this specific way. Well, but what if you look at it as though it's not an ion? What if you look at it as just the way that this is the light wave, the way that this light wave, reacts to specific other light waves? And, it's just a completely new world that opens up when at least you can be open-minded to like some different ideas. And I don't know. There's some level of humility, I think, that we need as a species.
Yeah, an open-mindedness and, willingness to explore and do opposition research against the ideas that, we're already attached to. Yeah. These ideas that we're talking about, that's high technology. It's just not silicon microprocessors in the way that we think of or lasers or whatever that we think of as high technology today. But for those ancient civilizations, technology is tools. It's a way that you're able to accomplish stuff. And so if they were able to accomplish stuff that we don't know how to accomplish, to me, that counts as high technology. I'm going to point out, since you mentioned the atomic model and whatnot, that there's a channel on YouTube called Demystify Psi. It's run by a couple, Shiloh and Anastasia, and they are much better scientists than I am. They frankly make me feel dumb in the best of ways. And they have a secondary channel or a secondary show called Paradigm Drift. I've done 3 appearances on that. It's kind of like what's that comedy show, Kill Tony, where they you get 60 seconds, you get an elevator pitch to impress this comedian with your comedy. Except it's scientific theories instead of comedy.
Yeah, cool.
So I've given them some of my elevator pitches for some of the I guess whatever I could conceivably condense into 60 seconds, which given that we're doing a series to cover my research, like that's an interesting challenge for me. But sure. I'll just point out that they've shown significant interest and in my theories, and they haven't really raised any red flags at me. And like you said, light, it's just electromagnetic radiation. and it expanded. We're only familiar with the visible light spectrum plus a little bit on either side because of our technologies.
Right.
So it's like you said. And by the way, that couple, Shiloh and Anastasia, I think they're pretty close to releasing their book, which they're basically doing what you just said, which is like rethinking the atomic model. So yeah, that's definitely something that needs to happen, and we need people pitching new ideas to try to offer explanations for the stuff that we don't know how to explain yet.
Yeah. I had a conversation similar to that, to kind of touches similar aspects with Earth 21, and who was in the Bitcoin consciousness group, and he and I talked a little bit about like the flat Earth theory, and while I still am not really convinced to like change my model of the planet based on some of those arguments, some of the things that they put forth are, I think, at least worth a reconsideration. Like one thing that sort of blew my mind a little bit, because I never really thought about it, and I did look up a YouTube video to explain it, but like, how does a rocket in space, if you're traveling to the moon, how does a rocket actually propel you there if there's nothing to push against? And somehow, the theory, I think, kind of takes leaps and bounds to like, well, if there's no space, we've never been to space, we can't prove that the Earth is round. Those pictures are fake, blah blah blah. So the Earth might be a different shape. I think that's maybe a little further than at least that I want to go. However, I think that there is like a valid question there. How is it that, if there's no air to push against, if there's no, it's just like Newton's second law or whatever, equal and opposite reaction. It's all a contained system. So what's propelling this thing forward? So it's like,
it would have to be the initial vector of like the launch velocity as you escape Earth's atmosphere would be your travel velocity all the way. You wouldn't be able to gain any thrust. Although I have heard, I don't know how valid of a concept this is, of something like solar sails, where photons are bouncing off of these sails, and like photons have this wave particle duality. So perhaps, solar sails could somehow pick up some kind of momentum, but by, capturing light running into them or something. I don't know. Again, I'm not that good of a scientist, so I would yield to better scientists than me if they told me that was dumb. But, I've seen that concept at least spoken of or presented online before.
Yeah, so it's like there are all these models for reality which are kind of generally accepted, and if you begin to question them, then you're crazy or you're an idiot. But I think they tend to hold us back in a lot of regards. I think that there is a very valid reason for asking some of these things, or at least just conversing about them. You can't. I don't think there's anything wrong with just having a genuinely curious conversation about something. I don't think anybody should be. It goes back to the old cliche, which is there are no stupid questions. I think that really. Yeah, really, we should be seeing the world that way. You shouldn't feel bad about asking any kind of question. I think that ultimately things might be easier to answer because consilience points to a pretty obvious average, a pretty obvious truth. But other times it's like, okay, maybe there is a little bit of wiggle room here. There's not like a black and white answer, so.
Yeah, two things I would respond to that with. First, my favorite response to the "there are no stupid questions" comment is, "Why does glass taste like blood?" That usually gets a laugh out of people.
It worked.
And let's see, the other one was, oh gosh, what was it? I think I lost the handle on it.
Oh, no stupid questions.
Oh, I think I lost it. It's all right. If it comes to me, I'll bring it back up.
Yeah, it's all good. So anyway, yeah, I think that, questioning things like the...
Oh, I'm sorry, I got it. It just came to me.
Yep.
Truth does not proceed upon consensus. Now, as Bitcoiners, truth does proceed upon consensus on the blockchain, but that's not how it works in meat space. We were talking flat Earth, or let's move away from flat Earth to the heliocentric versus the geocentric models of the universe, right? If truth proceeded upon consensus, the Earth would have been the center of the universe,
right?
Until we decided that it wasn't.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, boom, the universe is just like, oh, well, they decided now, we got to change, guys.
Yeah, right.
So it's just one of those things. I actually had to tell, I had my first AI conversation just the other day.
Oh, yeah.
I had a conversation with Elon Musk's Grok on X after I saw him post about how Grok is the only honest AI, right? Obviously trying to put this product. It's like, okay, let's put this to the test. And I asked Grok what the ancient Egyptians used their sarcophagi for, which is something we'll get into in subsequent episodes. And it fed me the consensus narrative that they were used for pharaonic burial in the king's chamber and the queen's chamber.
Right.
I was like, nope, sorry, dude, that's not what it is, at least according to my research. And consensus, the truth does not proceed upon consensus. That's what the history of science shows us.
Right.
We study Marie Curie and Darwin and Da Vinci and all these greats from history, Newton, and we celebrate them because they figured something out that everyone else was wrong about and had to fight against the current of popular opinion, and ultimately they were vindicated, and that's worthy of honor and celebration. And so anyone who has studied any amount of science in their education background, even in just grade school science, ought to be comfortable with the idea that truth does not proceed upon consensus. One person can be and has been right, or at least less wrong, maybe is a better way of putting it, than the consensus held opinion of their day and age many times throughout history. So we have to be open-minded and receptive to these new ideas. That's how a real scientist thinks. They absorb these ideas when they come out, they test them however they can, and if they get viable results, then they kind of offer their blessing in terms of peer review, and we move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I had something I was going to add, but it's escaping me now, I think.
Me remembering mine cut you off from yours.
It's okay. I think what I wanted to add from...
And my stupid question was the last thing before I remembered the next thing. Why does the last taste like blood, if that was it for you?
No, it wasn't. So, from a spiritual perspective, from the more esoteric perspective, one of the commonly accepted models for reality, in fact, I'm sure that Rob probably talks about this in the Law of One, is that human beings and thought energy are the creators of reality. So, when you had said that, when human beings suddenly began to switch from the heliocentric to basically switch the models, that spiritual model would actually maybe purport that because human consciousness is now reflecting a different reality or different belief set, then the reality itself changes. So it's like maybe in some aspects it does. The only one explanation could be that, because time isn't linear, we are still a very limited blip, in the grand scheme of all of the infinite time space. we're such a small little blip as far as the beliefs that we have and what we are, I guess, creating. And so we're up against a very massive, a very large group of and amount of time and space of others. So if ours were to, even if our collective beliefs would be pretty aligned with one another. So let's say that everybody on the planet believes that the planet is spherical when actually it's flat. You still have like the nonlinear time-space reality of all the other people who are creating the different reality of the Earth itself being flat. So I don't know. It's kind of an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah. Like manifestation.
Yeah, right.
And one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite bands, Wookiefoot, is "What you believe is what you receive." Mm-hmm. So, and that is valid, and so is the manifestation thing at certain levels. Mm-hmm. If I believed that you thought I was a complete idiot, and your utterances, as I go through and lay out this research, I might be particularly defensive and combative mm-hmm. in my responses to your, utterances, which may otherwise be interpreted as affirmative. Like my mindset very much can change how I perceive our interactions. Mm-hmm. And if I'm believing that you are, in opposition to me, I'm going to treat you as though you are in opposition to me, and you're going to experience that. And then that's going to, color the way that you interact with me in return, potentially. I mean, you're a pretty chill dude, so I don't think that would happen, but, hypotheticals here. And then on the other hand, sort of continuing that with the manifestation thought, again, going back to the idea of thought forms as being actual entities sort of on the other side of the veil, and things having either a positive, like a service to others polarity, or a negative or a service to self polarity. Mm-hmm. If you are a service to others oriented thought form and someone sort of invokes you, then maybe you, as a service to others oriented thought form, manifest for that person. And, that there are reports, there's stories out there of people who have, used positive manifestation to win a bunch of radio contests or whatever 80 years ago type of thing. Yeah. So, it's not completely an absurd concept to consider that, what we believe is, in some way shaping reality. Yeah. I think there's, a line of nuance, though, that sort of zigzags its way through that thought, and certain things are influenceable and maybe other things are less influenceable. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, there's if I just kind of feel into it, I mean, you can sit and meditate, and you can tap into, let's say, the power of the earth. You just focus on what the earth feels like, and it is an immensely powerful being, and so it's one of the cool things about this life experience and this reality is I think that we each have the ability to experience life exactly as how we want to create it and how we want to experience it. But then there are also certain kind of limitations or rules to the game that are, I wouldn't necessarily say untouchable, because I truly believe that anything is possible if you're really that powerful. But at certain evolutionary levels, if you will, there are things that you cannot touch. So the shape of the planet, for instance, or the sun. You can't just flop the setting and the rising of the sun as one individual. However, maybe if you were able to make waves across, multiple beings across the entire, collective consciousness from now and forever, maybe you could do that. But it's like, you still have some limitation, because this is what God has created. God has created a limited form of itself. It's supposed to have, you're supposed to have some limitation. You're supposed to be experiencing life in a vacuum in some regards, kind of. So
I like that analogy a lot if it's applied to like sports.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned games, rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Every sport has rules,
right?
But within that rule set, you're free to, innovate and come up with new ways of, acting and operating
mm-hmm.
on that field of competition. I mean, look at Lionel Messi. The guy has completely changed the game of soccer or football, however you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's just the way that he sees the ball and his precision and the way he dribbles. And the guy is a proverbial game changer.
Right.
Nobody ever played like him really before, and they call him the little magician for a reason. He's not violating the rules of the game, but he does see it in a different way, and that allows him to excel above and beyond all of his peers, all of his competitors, all of his teammates.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah, and perhaps there's like... perhaps he could get so good at doing some kind of specific move that it would inspire other players to become really good at that one thing, to the point where the game almost becomes like not fun anymore. It's because it's like, okay, a perfect example would be basketball. So it's like, if there's some like training program, nutritional program, even better example is baseball. Like steroid use was a pretty common thing for a while, and I don't even think it was necessarily outlawed. But because these players were basically hacking the game by hacking their bodies, they were giving themselves a leg up. And if everybody has like broken that rule set where they don't have the limitation of their physical bodies anymore, then it's like, okay, you've kind of made the game not so fun anymore. So we either need to, add another rule that you can't do this kind of thing. We need to limit this aspect, or the game itself needs to change to accommodate for it. So, steroids is like not a great example because it's like not good for the body, but let's say that there is a healthy version of it. Like you have to make the field bigger. Oh, there you go.
In 1968, the St. Louis Cardinals starting pitcher Bob Gibson, Hall of Famer, had a 1.12 ERA, which means every 9 innings he pitched, on average, he only gave up 1.12 runs.
Wow.
Which is phenomenally low.
Right.
It was such a dominating performance that the next year, Major League Baseball implemented a rule change.
Yeah.
They lowered the pitching mound by 6 inches.
No way.
To give less of a vertical advantage, less of a gravity advantage to pitchers.
Right. Yeah, so it's like, if you break the expectation for what's capable within the reality, then either the reality's got to shift to make it fun again, or you just basically that's it. The reality has to shift to make it challenging once again. And so I think that's maybe that's like the foundation of what spiritual evolution is. It's figuring out how do we keep pushing the limitations, pushing the boundaries, and then what's the next thing that we can break.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. That's where all the cool stuff is.
For sure. Cool. Well, this has been fun as always, and I look forward to our next one. Thank you for your time this evening.
Absolutely.